America did not begin with the Constitution. It began with a problem. After defeating the British Empire, the 13 former colonies had won their independence, but they still had to answer a dangerous question. Who would govern the United States now? They had just fought a revolution against centralized power, royal authority, and distant rule. The last thing they wanted was to build another system that looked anything like the one they had just overthrown. So, in the aftermath of victory, the new nation created its first national government, the Articles of Confederation. It was meant to protect liberty by keeping central power weak. But that solution would soon create a crisis of its own. Before America built the government it still has today, it had to survive the failure of the one that came first. The Articles of Confederation were America's first governing framework, ratified in 1781, during the final years of the Revolutionary War. On paper, they joined the states together in a firm league of friendship. But this was less a strong national government than a loose alliance. There was a Congress, but no president to enforce laws, and no national court system to settle major disputes. Each state kept most of its power, sovereignty, and independence. Congress could debate, request, and recommend, but it had little authority to command. The states were united, but only loosely. The country existed, but its government was deliberately built to remain weak. Americans believed that was the safest path to preserving freedom. They would soon discover that a government too weak to threaten liberty might also be too weak to protect it. This weakness was not a mistake. It was the entire point. The men who designed the Articles had lived through British taxation, British military pressure, and British political control. They feared concentrated authority because they associated it with oppression. In their minds, a strong central government could become a new king by another name. So they tilted the balance sharply toward the states, believing local power was safer than national power. But by trying so hard to avoid tyranny, they created paralysis. The national government could not act decisively because it had been designed not to. It was allowed to exist, but not really to rule. That made sense in theory, especially after Revolution. In practice, it meant the United States had independence without effective national coordination, sovereignty without stability, and a government that often seemed unable to govern at all. The fatal weakness of the Articles was simple. Congress lacked the real powers a government needs in order to function. It could not levy taxes directly. It could only ask the states for money, and the states often refused or delayed. It could not regulate trade in a unified way. It could not reliably enforce its own decisions. It could not easily raise troops. Even making major changes required overwhelming state approval, which made reform painfully slow and often impossible. In other words, Congress had responsibility without power. It was expected to manage national problems while lacking the tools to solve them. The new republic had won a war, but now it struggled with peace. America had a flag, a name, and a Congress. Yet beneath the surface, the structure holding the Union together was alarmingly fragile. The government existed, but barely. As the years passed, the weaknesses of the system became harder to ignore. The states often behaved less like parts of one nation and more like separate countries protecting their own interests. They imposed trade barriers against one another, argued over Western lands, and pursued conflicting economic policies. Some printed their own unstable currency. Others taxed goods coming from neighboring states. Instead of working together as a coordinated republic, they frequently acted as rivals. This created confusion, resentment, and economic disorder. The promise of independence had been national unity, but the reality often felt like fragmentation. Americans had defeated Britain together, yet, under the Articles, they struggled to function together. The Union survived, but it lacked strength and coherence. The revolutionary dream of self-government was beginning to look vulnerable, as though liberty had been won, but durable nationhood had not yet been secured. One of the clearest signs of failure was financial. The Revolutionary War had left the new nation deeply in debt. Soldiers needed pay. Creditors expected repayment. The government needed funds for diplomacy, defense, and basic operations. But under the Articles, Congress had no dependable way to raise revenue. It could request money from the states, but requests were not commands. And when states chose their own needs over national ones, Congress was left desperate and ineffective. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a humiliation. The republic that had declared itself capable of governing without a king could not even reliably finance its own survival. A nation that could not pay its debts risked losing credibility at home and abroad. The victory of the Revolution suddenly looked less secure when the government born from that victory seemed weak, broke, and dependent on voluntary cooperation. Then came the event that shocked many American leaders into action: Shays Rebellion. In 1786 and 1787, farmers in Massachusetts, crushed by debt, taxes, and economic hardship, rose up in resistance. Led in part by Daniel Shays, they protested a system they believed was destroying ordinary people after the promises of the Revolution. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but what terrified the political class was not just the uprising itself. It was the deeper lesson. If unrest could spread and the national government could do little to respond, what exactly was holding the country together? To many observers, this was the moment the weakness of the Articles became impossible to dismiss. A government that could not preserve order, support economic stability, or respond effectively to crisis was not merely imperfect. It was failing. The Revolution had overthrown one system, but the replacement suddenly looked dangerously unstable. By 1787, many of America's leading figures had come to the same conclusion. The Articles of Confederation could not be saved in their current form. What began as an effort to revise the system soon became something much bigger. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia for what became the Constitutional Convention, where they decided not merely to patch the first government, but to replace it. The result would be a new framework with a stronger federal structure, clearer powers, and a better balance between national authority and local liberty. The Articles had served a purpose. They had helped bind the states together during and just after the Revolution. But they were too weak to govern a growing nation in peacetime. Their failure did not end the American experiment. It forced the next stage of it. The Constitution was not America's first beginning. It was America's second attempt. That is why the Articles of Confederation still matter. They reveal a core tension at the heart of American history. How strong should government be? Too much power can threaten freedom. Too little power can invite disorder, weakness, and collapse. America's first national government leaned so far toward weakness that it nearly proved fatal to the Union itself. And from that failure came one of the most important realizations in the nation's history. Liberty alone was not enough. A republic also needed structure, authority, and the capacity to act. The Constitution is often treated as the natural starting point of the United States, but the real story is more dramatic than that. Before the Constitution, there was an earlier system. Before stability, there was uncertainty. And before America found a form of government that could endure, it had to learn the hard way why its first one failed.